So the purpose of this video is to give you the rest of the information on the official United States poverty measure. So Mollie has her 48-cell matrix. She's devised her thresholds based on the Thrifty Food Plan. But the problem is that just having a threshold still isn't enough to actually measure poverty. You have to have something to compare to the threshold to know whether any particular household is poor or not poor. And you need that information to come up with any kind of poverty rate, to know how many people in the country are poor. And what you need to know is a household's annual pre-tax money income. But remember Mollie's assignment. She was told to use a survey that the Census Bureau was already administering to determine the economic well-being of American children. So the Census Bureau was already performing the task of getting information on people's income, and it is still the main official government agency responsible for gathering income data in the United States, reporting income data in the United States, and lots of other data as well. Besides administering the decennial census, which is basically how we figure out the population. We count everybody every 10 years. The Census Bureau does a whole lot of other things. They're basically a survey agency, and they administer lots of household surveys. They administer other kinds of surveys, business surveys, and so on. But if you just look at the list of their household surveys, it's pretty impressive. The big, huge surveys that they do are listed up at the top here. The American Community Survey is a huge ongoing survey that a ton of social scientists use as the basis of their research. But the major surveys on, let's say, housing are conducted by the Census Bureau. The Consumer Expenditure Survey is a huge one that we're going to learn more about when we study consumption approaches to poverty. The major crime survey in our country is the NCVS. That's conducted by the Census Bureau. The major health survey, the NHIS. Major education surveys are also conducted by the Census Bureau. All kinds of household surveys. And the instrument that Mollie was told to use is called the Current Population Survey, or the CPS. Now, how this survey is conducted is it's always happening. So the Census Bureau is always conducting the Current Population Survey, and every month they select 98,000 addresses. It's an address-based survey. And these addresses have been statistically determined to be representative of the country as a whole. So they send a letter to each of those 98,000 addresses saying, congratulations, you've been selected to be part of the CPS sample. And usually around 50 to 60,000 of those addresses turn out to be occupied and eligible and able to be interviewed. And then what happens is one adult, they call this the representative adult. One adult in the household is interviewed either in person. The Census Bureau has tons of little field offices all through the country, or mostly over the phone. And they're interviewed during the week containing the 19th day of the month. And that same adult is interviewed once per month for the next 3 months. Again, during the week containing the 19th day of the month. Each of these interviews takes about 10 or 15 minutes. And then what happens is the household at that address is not interviewed at all for 8 months, for the rest of the year. And then that same adult is interviewed again, in person or over the phone, for the same 4 months the following year. And the Census Bureau calls this a 484 survey design. Once you're in the sample for 16 months, but you're not interviewed for 8 of those. So once an address has been included in the sample, that address permanently leaves the CPS sample. This survey has been administered since 1940, so it's one of our best sources of longitudinal data. It gets tweaked, minor redesign, about once per decade. Recently, they've been changing the order in which some of the income questions are asked. But the CPS alone is not how we get our income data. In March of each year, there's a supplement that's added to the current population survey, and it's called the Annual Social and Economic Supplement, or the ASEC. So what happens is, if you get included in the CPS sample in March, the interviewer is going to add on some questions. So the interviewer is going to ask you whether anyone in your household received income from about 18 different sources, and they ask this question about the previous year. So they ask a simple yes or no question. Did anyone in your household receive income from earnings, from survivor benefits, from veterans benefits, from pensions or retirement accounts, from unemployment insurance, from workers' compensation, disability, even more? So that's a simple yes or no question. Did anyone in the household receive income during the previous year? And then for any yes answers, the interviewer goes back and asks the interviewee about the amount of income received by each member of the household. And again, they're asking this about the previous year. So if you got sampled in March of 2016, the CPS ASEC interviewer would ask you whether anyone in your household received income from, say, veterans benefits in 2015. And if you said yes, then they would come back and ask you about the amount. So it's interesting to note that the way in which we get information about people's income for statistical purposes in the United States is we simply ask them. We utilize a household survey approach to gathering data on incomes, and this income is self-reported. We'll talk about maybe other ways to gather data on incomes in class. We don't ask everyone about their income. We just ask a representative sample, about 60,000 every March. And so how we get our poverty rate in the United States is that the percentage of people in the March sample who report incomes to the interviewers that are below the poverty threshold for their household type and size gets extrapolated to become the nation's official poverty rate. Now, the first of several important notes is that we've really only been officially measuring poverty in the United States for about 50 years. And to put that in context, it's been, 240 years since the Declaration of Independence and 400 years since the Mayflower, so not a terribly long time frame. A second important note is who's in the CPS sample, and the Census Bureau always states this as a survey of the resident, civilian, non-institutionalized population. So what this means is several groups of people are not being sampled. Prisoners are considered institutionalized, and so they are not included in the sample. Anyone who lives in a nursing home or a long-term care facility is not sampled. These are not considered households. These are considered what's called group quarters. And group quarters are not included in the CPS sample. And this is a way in which you are also relevant to the current population survey. If you live in a dormitory, that's considered group quarters, and those are not households. Dormitories are not households. The only way in which you might be included in the CPS sample is if your household back at home, if the address back at home gets included in the sample and your family members were to report information on your behalf. Because we're talking about a household survey, the unsheltered homeless are not included in the CPS sample. And for the most part, the sheltered homeless as well, since shelters are also considered group quarters and not households. The military is also relevant. So soldiers who live in barracks, again, that's group quarters. So they would not be included in the sample. Any member of the armed services who doesn't belong to a household with at least one other civilian is also not included because it's a civilian survey. Another interesting case is foster children. The official poverty measure defines a household as people who co-reside, live together, at the same address, and who are legally related by birth or marriage. So foster children, although they co-reside, are not legally related, so they are not included in the sample. So we have to remember that we're just counting the resident civilian non-institutionalized population. So every September, we get an annual report from the Census Bureau on income and poverty, and it always looks pretty much the same. And usually this will come up in the news in September. And it always has the same structure. So basically they introduce how they measure poverty and the nature of the survey. And then there's a section on incomes, what we learn about incomes from the Current Population Survey, ASEC. And then there's a section on poverty. So in 2015, in the Census Bureau's 2015 official report, maybe you remember hearing this news back in September, in the income section, they reported that median household incomes were actually up by 5.2%, again, across all households. And this was important because it's just a hair below 2007 median household incomes, and that was the last year before our financial crisis and recession, most recent recession. So we're almost back up to the median household incomes we had before that crisis. And no group of people saw decreases in their median household incomes. The poverty news in the second section in the annual report was good news for the first time in a while. Poverty rates decreased from 14.8% in 2014 to 13.5% in 2015. And that was the biggest single year decrease since 1999, so in a long time. And the poverty population decreased by 3.5 million people from 2014, but it's still over 43 million people. But to put this in context, the annual report from the Census Bureau always shows this longitudinal graph. And so what we learn from this is that poverty rates, at least since 1970, if you look at that red line there, have basically bounced around between 10 and 15%, occasionally getting just a hair over 15%, but we haven't really seen any major decrease except from 1959 to 1970, and we've never had any poverty rate in any year we've been measuring and counting below 10%. So I have to put those changes in context. So I'm going to introduce several important distinctions here. And the first important distinction is between poverty and inequality. These are not the same thing, although we are going to talk more about economic inequality later on in the semester and how to measure it. But you can have lots of poverty and very little inequality. Think about very poor countries, right? If most people in the country are very poor, then you would have high poverty and very low inequality because everyone is more or less in the same income group. And also trends in poverty and inequality don't have to be going in the same direction. So poverty could be decreasing while inequality is increasing. In fact, this is what we're seeing in the United States. So we did see a decrease from 2014 to 2015 in poverty. But we saw an ever so slight increase in inequality, which has been increasing steadily in the United States. And we're talking about economic inequality here. So you can have decreases in one, increases in the other. So important to note that distinction. Another thing to note is that poor and low income are really not the same thing. Low income is a fuzzy term. Poverty is an official category with an official cutoff, but low income is not. Sometimes people will use certain income to poverty thresholds, which I'll talk about in a minute, to designate the low income population, but there is no official cutoff. So sometimes people will say if you have an income 1.5 times your poverty threshold, we can sort of classify you as low income. And some public assistance programs use other income to poverty ratios to determine whether people are eligible for those programs. So for example, the National School Lunch Program, you qualify for free lunch if your family's income to poverty threshold is 1.3 or below. You qualify for reduced price school lunch if your family's income is 1.85 times its poverty threshold. Another important distinction is between the concept of class and income quintiles or deciles. It just depends on how you slice up the data. You can slice up the population into fifths, tenths, fourths, whatever. The Census Bureau mostly divides the income groups into fifths or quintiles. But class is different. Class is a sociological category, and class is constructed through social networks that people belong to, their tastes and preferences for certain sorts of goods and commodities, their identities, and so we can empirically verify your income quintile. We cannot empirically verify your class because class is the result of meaning making, both in individuals and in communities. It's about how people understand themselves and how other people understand you. So a person could belong to a high income quintile, but be classified by others or classify themselves as lower class or middle class or working class or whatever. Some people take great pride in identifying as middle class or working class, even though they have very high income quintile. And similarly, you could be in a pretty low income quintile, but be classified by others or classify oneself as upper class, maybe because you wear a certain kind of clothing, maybe because you drink a certain type of, wine. So class is about identity, whereas income quintile is empirically verifiable. And here are the income quintiles from the Census Bureau's most recent report. You can see, if you know enough information about your family's household income, you can determine by looking at this chart here which income quintile your household is in. So a fifth of the population is in the lowest income quintile, which goes up to about $21,000. And they earned all of the income that was earned by that lowest quintile amounted to 3.1% of all the income that was earned in 2015. The highest income quintile, that is the top 20% of Americans, make over $112,000. So 20% of the population are in that group. And all of the income that was earned by those 20% of Americans totaled up to 51.2% of all income that was earned in 2015. So another important distinction is between the poverty rate and the poverty population. The poverty rate is always a percentage, and the poverty population is just a number of people. And one can go up while the other goes down, simply because of population growth. You might see the poverty population go up while rates are going down. Another important distinction is between chronic poverty and poverty spells. And the Census Bureau always reports this right at the very beginning of their annual report. Chronic poverty is defined by the Census Bureau as 48 consecutive months where a household's income is below its threshold, whereas a poverty spell is defined by the Census Bureau as simply 2 consecutive months where a household's income is below its poverty threshold. And what we learn from the Census Bureau's report is that chronic poverty is actually pretty rare in the United States. Only 2.7% of households experience poverty for 48 consecutive months, whereas over a third of American households have a poverty spell where they have incomes below their threshold for 2 consecutive months. But it's important to note that the Current Population Survey Annual Social and Economic Supplement cannot measure the duration of poverty because remember they have that 484 design, so they only follow a household for 16 months, and so they wouldn't know about 48 consecutive months. So the Census Bureau has another survey called the Survey of Income and Program Participation, and they use that survey to measure chronic poverty and the duration of poverty. Another important distinction is between poverty and deep poverty. So an income to poverty ratio is a common way to express how much income a household has relative to its poverty threshold. So if your income to poverty ratio is exactly 1, it means that your household has exactly as much income as your poverty threshold. And any income to poverty ratio below 1 indicates that your household is making less than its poverty threshold. Now, an income to poverty ratio of 0.5 is typically used by the Census Bureau as a cutoff for what they call deep poverty or extreme poverty. And anything above an income to poverty ratio of 1 indicates that the household is making more than its poverty threshold. You'll also hear this expressed as percentages. It's just a matter of switching the decimals around. You'll hear people talk about 150% of the poverty threshold. So important to know the difference between the percentages and the ratios. But the information we have on deep poverty is that it was a little less than half of the poverty population. So 6.1% of Americans are below 0.5 income to poverty ratio. So 6.1% of Americans are considered to be in deep poverty. The percentage of Americans who are under an income to poverty ratio of 2.0 is 31.7, pretty big group of people, so almost a third. And what that means is that 18.2% of Americans have incomes between their poverty threshold and twice their poverty threshold. So almost a fifth of Americans are in that zone between 1.0 and 2.0. The last important distinction is between poverty thresholds and poverty guidelines. So poverty thresholds are strictly used for statistical purposes. So calculating the poverty rate, and poverty thresholds are set by the Census Bureau, which is part of the Department of Commerce, the Cabinet Department of Commerce. Now, the poverty guidelines are actually set by another cabinet department, the Department of Health and Human Services, and they are used for determining whether a household is eligible for certain public assistance programs. And they're a little bit simpler than the poverty thresholds. It just counts the number of people in the household. It doesn't care about ages. And the 2015 poverty guidelines are shown here. So the thresholds aren't really used to see if you qualify for example, for free school lunch. The poverty guidelines would be used for that. And they aren't far off from the Census Bureau's thresholds, but they're a little bit simpler to use for administrative purposes. And we're going to learn a lot more about all of the different public assistance programs in the next class.